He told me he wasn't going to do a bio, but that was very nice. So I'm going to give you an introduction to Transmogrifier. My name is Chrissy Wainwright. I work for 6 Feet Up in the United States. I've been with them for almost 11 years now. So I started learning Transmogrifier a little over a year ago and encountered a problem in that it's very difficult to get started with Transmogrifier. For one thing, there's not much documentation. It's very spread out, and that's like just looking through the documentation of the add-on packages like collective.transmogrifier or transmogrify.dexterity. And even that documentation is very in-depth as far as what those packages do themselves. And so I was noticing there's really a lack of introductory documentation for someone that wants to learn how to use Transmogrifier. There's no quick way to get started. So a solution that I had for that was I created documentation that is now on training.plone.org. It is not on the very front page just yet because I just pushed it the other day. But this was the documentation that I used for the training yesterday here at the conference. The next problem is that, once again, getting started with migrations with Transmogrifier is not very easy. You know, you have to figure out, do you create an add-on? Do you add the pipeline to your existing custom package? How do you start the pipeline, get that going from scratch? And like even once you do that, it's really easy to forget all of the pieces that need to be hooked together to actually get it working. So the solution that I had for that was I created a Bob template package that will create setup and migration for you. It provides an initial pipeline, which will automatically work from a collective.jsonify export. So at this point, if you are exporting from a Plone site and importing into a new Plone site, using this migration package will be very easy for you to actually get all that imported over. So now we're going to do a demo. I'm going to switch over. And we'll actually do an introduction about learning Transmogrifier and how it works. Okay, so this is the documentation. If you go to training.plone.org/5/Transmogrifier, it gives you a short introduction as to what it is. If you're not familiar, the name Transmogrifier comes from Calvin and Hobbes comics. Calvin had created a box. It was just a cardboard box that he called a transmogrifier. It had some dials on it. And going into this box allowed him to change into other animals, creatures, other things. And the first thing he changed into was a tiger. So he and Hobbes were tigers together for a while. But in the context of Plone, it allows you to take the content from one Plone site, bring it into another one. You can even change it along the way if you're changing the content types. A good use case for this is that if your current older Plone site is using archetypes, once you bring it into a new Plone 5 site, then it will all be dexterity. So moving along in this training, first there's a page of information about exporting your current site content. For the purpose of this training, I've provided a sample export file. So I had taken a Plone 4 site, threw in a bunch of dummy content. I think the add-on was collective.lorem ipsum that I used to just make a bunch of news items, events, pages, and so on. And then created an export from that using collective.jsonify. And so that export is available for download here that you can use throughout this training if you are walking through this on your own. Otherwise, if you need instructions for how to export from your current Plone site, that is provided here. So now you might be wondering, there are multiple ways that you can upgrade your Plone site to Plone 5, like if you have an existing Plone 4 setup. You can just do a standalone migration in place, change the version numbers, run build out, get that all going. But you may have some reasons, there are some good reasons why you may want to not go with that path and instead use Transmogrifier or some other method. One of those would be as if you are currently on a very old version of Plone. Like if you have a site that is still way back on Plone 2, you can use this method to bring all of your content into Plone 5, and it's going to be way easier than just migrating all of the content in place. Also, if your site has been around for a while, Let's say you originally created the site in Plone 2 and have upgraded it along the way. You may have a lot of cruft that's still in there. You may have some things that aren't working quite right. So it can be a good way to provide a fresh start with a new Plone 5 instance. Similarly, if you're looking to drastically update your site, maybe not even keep all of the content, but just a few items, this would also be a good use case. We did this with the 6 Feet Up site this past year. Got it into a new Plone 5 instance, brought over a few pages, but not all of them, and was able to give us a nice fresh start. So the steps are all here. I'm not going to run through these right now. And then there's a brief step further down about exporting from WordPress. I'd originally hoped with this training I could provide a way to easily export your content from WordPress, import it into Plone, but I didn't quite get that far. I couldn't get that working. So I just focused on doing this introduction, making sure that people know how to actually use Transmogrifier. So let's actually create the migration package. Like I mentioned, there is now a Mr. Bob template that will do this for you. It's not actually a Mr. Bob core just yet, but we're almost there. But I'm going to go ahead and run an example. So I'm going to run the Mr. Bob command. I'm going to create a package called test.migration, and it's using the bobtemplates.plone template called migration package. And if you've done anything like this with Mr. Bob, Templar, Paster, or whatever in the past, this will be very similar, asking you a few questions. I'm going to pass in the latest version of Plone 5.1.4. And so now that has created my test.migration package. It is an add-on package, but it's also set up to be its own build-out, so we can set it up with a virtual env and get it running. So I'm going to do that really quick. And these steps are also here on the documentation page. I can zoom in a little bit. So I'm just going to create a virtual env, install build-out, and then let that run for a couple minutes. So now before you run the import, so you get your new Plone 5 site set up, you're not quite importing the new the content in yet. There are some things that you might need to set up before actually doing the import, especially if you have any custom content types that you are wanting to bring over. You need to make sure that those custom content types are set up as dexterity content types in the new Plone site, so that when the import is run, it will see that and automatically bring those items over. And it will happen automatically as long as you keep the name of the content type and the name of all the fields the same. Then there won't be any additional steps that you'll need to take. But if you do change the name of the content type, you'll need to adjust your pipeline a little bit to handle those changes. Okay, so now let's talk about the actual terminology, the setup of the Transmogrifier, the pipeline, and everything. So the pipeline is a config file very similar to, or the same as what you see with build-out. So if you're familiar with editing build-out files, then this is going to look familiar. At the very top of the file is the Transmogrifier part, which specifies a pipeline. And in the pipeline are all of the steps that are going to be run as part of the pipeline. So here we have a section 1, section 2, section 3, and those point to parts further down the file. I do have spaces in here, I realized, and that may not work. Use dashes or underscores. But the idea is going to be the same, that here you specify the parts in the order that they will run. The parts are defined further down the file, pointing to the blueprints, which is the Python code that is going to run for each of those steps. Like I said, a blueprint is just each of those steps, some Python code that's going to run. There are lots of blueprints that are already available inside of the Transmogrifier add-ons, like collective.transmogrifier and transmogrify.dexterity. And then you can also add some custom blueprints to handle any of your custom content or anything additional that you need to do with your content. All right, so here's a visualization of what happens when the content is imported with Transmogrifier. So up here at the top, I have some exported content. This will restart here in a minute. So let's say we have 5 items as part of the export. You can see that each one of those goes through the pipeline on its own, each one hitting each of the steps through the pipeline, and then in the end coming out as a content object. Now you can see at this part in the middle, the constructor, that's the part of the pipeline that actually creates the object in the new Plone site based on that exported content. So then it goes through each one. The first one is a folder, so it makes that folder at the root of the site. The second one comes through as a document. The third one comes through as an image, each under that first folder. And then say the fourth one is another folder that's at the root of the site. The order that it follows of the exported content is just how collective.jsonify had exported the content, which it walks through the entire original Plone site. Go to the first folder at the root of the site and go down through the tree of that folder, exporting a single JSON file for each item that it comes across. And then it just moves through the entire site that way. So then when everything is imported, it's imported in that same order, so that folders are imported first and then their children, because you can't import the children first, otherwise there's nothing to put them into and they won't get imported. Okay, let's see if that build out worked. It did. Hit that dot. Okay, so I'm going to open up this test migration that was created so you can see what all of this looks like. So we have a package. It has an import folder, profiles, tests, and inside of import, there's an import config, a CFG. So this has a sample pipeline. Now, like I said earlier, this pipeline is already set up to work with a collective.jsonify export. So here in a few minutes, I'll actually start up the site and import content. It's going to use this pipeline to import everything. The most important pieces of a pipeline, everything that I put in here isn't necessary. But the ones I want to point out are the JSON source. So in this case, you can look down further at the part, the JSON source. And this is just telling the Transmogrifier where to find the exported content. And so it's going to expect it to be in a folder called content-import at the root of the build-out. Let's see, we have some other pieces here. The next is the constructor, which, as I mentioned, looking at the graphic, this is the part that actually creates the object in the Plone site based on the exported content. And then the schema updater will update that object with all of the information, all of the fields, properties, everything like that. So as you're creating your own blueprints or adding new ones, you'll have to decide where in this order that it goes, because the order is very important. Each step can build upon the previous steps as well. So you need to keep that in mind, for when you want a new step to go in place. When you start the import, a dictionary is created for the item. So you have the JSON item, all that information. It goes into a dictionary called item. And then at that point, that goes through that whole pipeline, and then you can access the information in that dictionary and manipulate it. And anything that you manipulate before the constructor, then at that point when it gets created in the Plone site, it works based on that modified information from the previous steps in the pipeline. And then if you need to make adjustments to the object after it has been created in the Plone site, then that step is going to need to go after the constructor in the pipeline. Then here in the training, if you want to read this later, I have more information about each of the other steps that are there in the pipeline and what they're for. And also adding an example pipeline step. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail right now, but provided information about how to create your own custom blueprints. All the files are in place for this, and there's also an example here. This is commented out, so right now this step in the pipeline would not run. But as you come further down, you can see this is calling the blueprint test.example, which is created here inside of the test.migration package. The name here that is used matches what's set in the configure.zacml. So here the blueprint is set up as a utility called test.example, and then it's pointing to the example class in blueprints.py. So once you start creating your own blueprints, if you need to add some custom ones, you can use this, copy and paste this code, and then modify it to what you need it to do. All right, so now let's actually run the import. So first of all, I'm going to put the exported files in place. So at the root of the build out, so in test.migration, I already have my content import folder here. I'm just going to throw in there. And you can see the way that this is set up is how JSONify had exported it. That inside of that content import folder, it's going to be expecting some numbered folders in there. So usually starting at 0, 1. They don't have to be sequential. They don't have to start at 0, but they do need to be numbers. And if we open the next one up, then you can see all those individual JSON files for all of the exported content. And if I want to open that up and see what that looks like, I can just open one of these and see that here it's that dictionary of all of the information. The most important piece is the path, because this is how when all of the items get created in the new Plone site, it's going to be based on that path as far as where they go and everything. Okay, I'm going to start up the Plone site, and we'll actually import that content. Of course, first, I do need to create the Plone site, and I'll just give it the ID Plone. And then I'll go to the ZMI. First, I will install the add-on, so just the test.migration default. We won't do the import yet. There's a different way to do that. So now, from this point, I've set up two different ways that you can actually run the import. The first one, the simpler one that you'll likely start with, is to just run all of the import steps. And that can be done in Portal Setup. From the Import tab, you'll find the name of the add-on, so test.migration and import. And then you have the option to import all steps. Now, I'd also set up a way that this can be run with upgrade steps. So if you get test.migration.default here, choose the profile. You may need to look at the old steps. But you can see that by default, there are 3 steps in place. And I'll go ahead and open up this code so you can see what it looks like. So there's a pre-migration step for anything that you need to do before the actual migration is run. A step for the migration itself, and then another step for anything that you need to do after the import has been run. The main reason I found this was necessary was for disabling subscribers. So like, for example, if you have a form gen that you are importing, if you're familiar with form gen or easy form, you know that in the site, when you add a new form, it automatically adds some fields for you, like name, email address, comments. And when you're running an import, you don't want those to be put back in there, because your form is already set. You already have the fields you want. You don't want more thrown in. So you can disable the subscriber before running the migration and then re-enable it afterwards. And this provides hopefully good details to show you how to do that. So if you have a subscriber that looks like this, that say is for the document content type, that is listening for the iObjectModified event. And then here's the name of that handler. What you will do is you will run the unregister handler using the subscriber name, which matches this, the function name here, the content type, and the event. And then on the end, very similar, except this time you'll be doing a register handler instead of unregister to put it back in. All right, I should have gone ahead and run this because it's a fairly large import. But once you click that Import All Steps button, if you have the site running in the foreground, you can go look in the console and see everything as it's being imported. And you can see this because there is a logger. So if I go back and look at the pipeline, right after the JSON source, I've put a logger in here. It has the name Transmogrifier and importing, so you can see that's what's prepended onto each one of these. And then it's showing the path for each item as it's being imported. And that's specified here as the key that's being displayed with level info. And you can change that level so that, depending on which instance you are importing on, then you're going to have different levels of logging. Yes, yeah, you can have it output even the entire item dictionary. And I do have examples of that, not in here. But yeah, and then if you're doing that, I recommend hiding. You can hide certain keys, so you don't want to show the files and the images because those are all base64 encoded and they're huge. Let me see. I have a list of a few common errors here. Of course, I'd like to expand this a little bit, but these are the ones, especially starting out, I run into the most often. If you don't put your content import folder in place, or you have a typo, you put it in the wrong place, then this is the error that you're going to get, is that the path content import does not exist. Similarly, if you don't have the numbered folders inside of content import, you're going to get this value error. In this case, I had just put in a folder called X, and it didn't like that. You may also get an attribute error of set object. So like, let's say in your old Plone site, you had made something like news items folder-ish, but in the new Plone site, by default, they're not. So as the import runs, if it's trying to put something inside of a news item that's not allowed, then it's going to stop. You're going to get this attribute error of set object. And then I've got some tips. Debugging other errors as you get into the site, into the import, because especially as you start writing your own custom code, you're likely going to run into a lot of errors, and they're not always really super easy to figure out. Of course, start with reading the traceback. Sometimes the traceback does do a really good job of pointing you to exactly where the problem is, but then sometimes you'll find that it's pointing at the for item and self.previous, which is one of the pieces that's in every blueprint, and just pointing to all of those, which isn't helpful because that's not where the error is actually happening. So what you can do about that is you can add in a set trace. You can put it into your own custom blueprints, or you can also put it in the pipeline, just as a PDB. And this takes a condition. So in this case, in the condition I set Python equals true, so it would hit this every single time. Now, if you know instead that the error is happening on a collection, then you can change that condition so that it will only give you a PDB when you're on a collection. And then from there, if you still can't figure out exactly what's going on, find the offending item in the exported data. So when you see a traceback in the log, right above that, you're going to see that output message, one of these that tells you exactly what item it was currently on that was importing. So you can grab that, grab the path, and then grep through the export to find that particular item. And then looking at that raw data can really help you sometimes to figure out exactly what the problem is. It's not always obvious, trying to do it from the debugger. And then from there, you can limit the number of items that are being exported. So right now, my content import folder, I have everything in there. But if I get down and find exactly which item is throwing an error, then I can move everything else out of the way. So like if I create a new folder, I can take everything and put it over there so it's not in content import, and then only put the file or maybe just a few files that I know are going to cause a problem and run the import against those so I can make sure that I've fixed my problem. And then once it's fixed, then of course you'll want to put everything back in, maybe run through it again, or just 1 or 2 folders if it's a large export, just to make sure you didn't break anything else. And this is also a good reason to use tests for your imports. Write some test cases, not only for just the errors that you encounter, but just against the default items being imported, so that you have something to test against. It can be very easy to break things during an import. Let's see. Still going. Should have made that smaller. That's okay. You can run an import multiple times. So like when you need to run an import again, you don't have to clear out all of your data in your Plone site. It's just when you run a new import, it's going to update all of the items. So like if you're going through a long process of creating a new import, the original site, maybe the content is being updated along the way, and you need to do another export and test that. You don't have to clear out the content in your test site that you're importing into. It'll just work on top of that. But there are some caveats to that. So like each time the import is run, the objects in the Plone site will get updated. So if you go look at the history view, you'll see when that import ran. And so some content editors are picky about that and want that to be limited. Also keep in mind that items do not get deleted. So if in the original site an item was deleted, you do a new export, import that in, it's not actually going to delete that item. You would have to write a custom blueprint to handle that. And similarly, if something was deleted, like you had a document that had been deleted and recreated as a folder using the exact same ID, you're going to run into problems with that on the import as well. So if you plan to run the import multiple times this way, just make sure to write your custom blueprints in a way that's going to handle that and not duplicate anything. The last couple pages here of the documentation are just some advanced tips for the pipelines. I'm not going to go over this too much right now. The pipelines and the blueprints, just additional information about those. So let's see if we have anything in the Plone site yet. Because part of the pipeline here, the very last step, is a save point. It does a partial commit every 1,000 items. So each of those folders in the import, so there was a 0 and a 1, they're batched in sets of 1,000. So that first item folder has 1,000 items. So at this point, after it does the first folder, it'll do a partial commit for those items that they'll already be on the site. So there they are. I have my new front page. I have some events. I have a bunch of news. And this is also helpful when when you're running the import. Like let's say you have 50 folders worth of content being imported. You start running the import, and at folder 14, you hit an error. You can go fix the error, but instead of starting over from scratch, you can clear out those first 13 folders, restart at folder 14, and then run the rest of the migration from there. If you want to reduce that number, you can set that to whatever you want it to there in the pipeline. Okay, so that's what I've got. Do we have any questions? Andreas? Oh, let's get a mic. Come on,
Slacker. Hi, thanks for your talk. Is there 2 questions? Can you migrate old-style collections with Transmogrifier? And second question, is there a solution for this well-known problem that the modified timestamp is always set to the date time of the migration? Is there some solution for that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the collections. So yeah, you're talking about like the original topics. I don't remember if those work I think I've only run into them a couple times, and I know the one time I did have to write some custom code to just handle the queries for those. And then as far as the modified time, you can write a custom blueprint to handle that so that it make sure that it does show the actual last person that edited it. I think it's a good idea though to still leave the imported one in there, just because then you know something happened at that time, and make sure the content editors are aware. They're going to know that the content moved at some point. So I think that one is good to keep. But if you want the item history, I was talking about this with Philip last night. I do have a fork of collective.jsonify that will export the history of all of the items. Basically what it does is that it will look through the revision history, create a separate JSON file for each one, starting with the oldest, so that as they're imported into the new site, it's going to automatically rebuild that whole history. The only issue with that is that it doesn't have the metadata, so you do have to write a custom blueprint on top of that to show who did it and the correct date for when that happened.
Also, the default migration handles both, so it migrates old-style topics, even folderish topics, and it does not change the modified date. And both parts of code could be vandalized into JSON migrator. Yeah, the modification time is not changed during the default in-place migration because there's a patch. It's set in an event handler, and that event handler is patched in the migration. Both, even topic migrations and that patch, are both in Plone content types. That code can just also be used in Transmogrifier. Just needs to be copied.
And as a last resort, you always can do a post-migration pipeline to overwrite those states again based on your actual data.
How did you export this? Do you have an export pipeline for that? Or?
No, I just use collective.jsonify.
But is this working the same way? Or?
So the steps that are here, install collective.jsonify into the build out, or if you don't have if it's old enough, you don't have a build out, you can add it to the products folder. And then it's a matter of adding an external method and just running that, and then it will export all of that content. And so nothing special was done for this one that I used for the example.
I also have a question, not about the Transmogrifier, but JSONify. Do you get portlets and local roles out of that?
No.
Okay, that's a pity.
I mean, there is, the local roles are saved in the JSONify export, and then there is an additional step to the pipeline that you need to add, and that one already exists in one of the maybe collective Transmogrifier to import those local roles to reset them on all the objects. But then it's even a separate thing completely if you need to also import users and groups information. And that I also have the steps in there as part of this training. Mike?
Portlets and local roles are handled by the default migration.
Okay, good to know.
So the export, if there's something missing in the export, you cannot customize it. You have to have a fork of this package, or how? I mean, I can imagine the same way we go in, you can also export. I mean, there's also in the Transmogrifier world export steps and things like that.
Yeah, because JSONify will only export content items, like as Philip said. It's not going to export any portlet information, nothing about users. It's specifically for content. So if you need to export any additional information, that will be extra steps.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Up here, Philip.
Okay. Sorry.
I see from the example, by using the copy UID pipeline, we can migrate a Plone site to another, keeping the item UID remain the same, right?
Yes, the UID will remain. So if you have links in TinyMCE that are using the resolve UID, those will continue to work.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you very much. Chrissy, give a applause.